They were celebrated on the country stage, beloved for their heartfelt songs and down-to-earth charm. But once the spotlight shifted to Hollywood, these singers revealed a darker side that shocked fans everywhere. From roles as brutal villains on screen to scandals that painted them as antagonists offstage, their legacies took an unexpected turn. In this video, we uncover the 10 country singers who became Hollywood villains offstage, and the stories that forever changed how the world saw them. In the 1980s, Dwight Yoakam stormed onto the country music scene as an unstoppable force. He wasn't Nashville polished or radio-friendly in the traditional sense. He was raw, brash, and carried an outlaw spirit that audiences craved. With his tight jeans, low-slung cowboy hat, and a voice that cut through with honky-tonk grit, Yoakam revived a sound that seemed forgotten. His debut album, Guitars, Cadillacs, etc., etc., was a revelation, blending traditional Bakersfield-style country with rock energy, and it catapulted him to stardom. On stage, Dwight was magnetic, the perfect mix of rebel and romantic, the kind of performer who made fans believe every word he sang about heartbreak and barroom nights. But when Dwight Yoakam made the leap to Hollywood, the image began to fracture. Rather than playing heroes or charming cowboys, he shocked audiences by diving headfirst into villainy. In Billy Bob Thornton's Sling Blade, 1996, Yoakam took on the role of Doyle Hargraves, a violent, abusive boyfriend whose cruelty toward a young boy and his mother was stomach-turning. He played it with such terrifying realism that audiences couldn't shake the feeling they were seeing the real Dwight beneath the cowboy hat. Critics applauded his chilling performance, but for many country fans, it was jarring. Their honky-tonk hero had transformed into a monster on screen, and some wondered if he had revealed something darker about himself in the process. Hollywood noticed, and soon Dwight was being cast again and again in sinister roles. In Panic Room, 2002, he was one of the masked intruders terrorizing a mother and daughter. In Crank, 2006, he embodied a shady, unsettling doctor. Each time, Yoakam brought an unnerving authenticity that made audiences recoil. For better or worse, he became Hollywood's go-to country star for menace, not charm. Unlike fellow singers who took safe roles that maintained their likable image, Dwight leaned into darkness, embracing characters that left viewers unsettled. Off-screen, whispers about his personality added fuel to the fire. He was said to be demanding, difficult on set, and uncompromising, a perfectionist who clashed with collaborators. While those close to him argued this was simply his commitment to excellence, others painted him as arrogant and abrasive, feeding the narrative that his villainous roles weren't far removed from reality. In an industry hungry for scandal, these stories stuck. In the end, Dwight Yoakam's crossover from country stage to Hollywood screen reshaped his legacy. He remains celebrated as one of country's most innovative voices, yet his Hollywood career has indelibly branded him as a villain. To some, it was a betrayal of the honky-tonk spirit they once adored. To others, it was proof of his range, his refusal to be boxed in as just another cowboy singer. Either way, Dwight Yoakam will forever be remembered as the country star who became Hollywood's most convincing bad guy. Kristofferson was never an ordinary country singer. From the moment he emerged in the late 1960s and early 1970s, he carried an aura of intellectual depth and rugged rebellion that set him apart from the Nashville mainstream. His songwriting alone secured him a place in music history. Me and Bobby McGee, Sunday Morning Comin' Down, and Help Me Make It Through the Night weren't just hits. They were poetic testaments to heartbreak, restlessness, and the human condition. Fans saw Kristofferson as a philosopher-poet in cowboy boots, a man whose gravelly voice and sharp lyrics spoke to deeper truths. But his restless spirit pulled him far beyond Music Row. Hollywood quickly took notice of his charisma, rugged looks, and aura of authenticity. Kristofferson stepped into acting with ease, landing roles in films like Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, 1973, and Alice Doesn't Live Here Anymore, 1974. At first, audiences embraced him as the romantic outlaw, the scrappy drifter who carried his guitar into the cinematic West. Yet as his career developed, a darker narrative began to form. Hollywood often cast him not as the heroic cowboy, but as the flawed, self-destructive man, a figure whose charm was laced with menace. By the time he starred opposite Barbra Streisand in A Star is Born, 1976, Kristofferson embodied the tragic archetype of the fallen star. His portrayal of John Norman Howard, a drunken, volatile musician spiraling out of control, was so raw that fans questioned how much of it was acting and how much was a reflection of his own turbulent life. Behind the scenes, his struggles with alcohol, drug use, and an explosive temper only reinforced the villain image. Hollywood, ever hungry for scandal, painted him as a reckless, difficult man whose charisma masked destructive tendencies. The 1980s further complicated his reputation. While he delivered strong performances in films like Heaven's Gate and Convoy, his association with troubled productions and his increasingly hardened on-screen persona shifted his image from outlaw poet to hardened anti-hero. By the time he appeared in the Blade trilogy during the late 1990s, playing Whistler, a grizzled mentor with morally ambiguous shades, Kristofferson had firmly cemented himself as a Hollywood figure who thrived in roles tinged with darkness. Offstage, he was equally polarizing. Admirers praised his intellect, political activism, and unwillingness to compromise. Critics, however, described him as arrogant, moody, and confrontational. For country fans who had once idolized the songwriter with the tender heart, this Hollywood evolution into an abrasive, villain-coded figure felt like a betrayal. Yet Kristofferson's journey reveals the complexity of fame. He was both poet and fighter, romantic and rogue, star and self-saboteur. In Hollywood, his villainous image overshadowed his country roots, transforming him from Nashville's philosopher into a cinematic figure of darkness and danger. To this day, Kristofferson remains a reminder that the line between art and life can blur, sometimes until audiences can't tell the hero from the villain. Tim McGraw. Tim McGraw is often remembered as one of the most polished stars of 1990s and 2000s country music. With his smooth baritone voice, a string of chart-topping hits like Don't Take the Girl and Live Like You Were Dying, and his picture-perfect marriage to Faith Hill, McGraw projected the image of country music royalty. He was the all-American everyman, the cowboy hat-wearing superstar who seemed untouchable both on stage and in his carefully managed public life. But when he transitioned into Hollywood, audiences discovered a very different side of him, one that aligned less with the charming hitmaker and more with characters cloaked in grit, menace, and shades of villainy. His Hollywood breakthrough came with Friday Night Lights, 2004, where he played Charles Billingsley, an abusive, alcoholic father whose relentless pressure on his son bordered on cruelty. The performance stunned audiences. This wasn't the McGraw they knew from stadium stages. This was a man seething with anger and bitterness, a father so toxic that he became one of the film's true antagonists. Critics praised the authenticity of his performance, but fans were unsettled. For some, the role blurred uncomfortably with rumors of McGraw's own fiery temper and past struggles with alcohol, making his portrayal feel more real than they expected. McGraw leaned into this darker persona with later roles. In The Blind Side, 2009, although he played the adoptive father of Michael Oher, some critics noted that his character's harsh edges carried echoes of his earlier villainous roles. In Four Christmases, 2008, he portrayed a rough and somewhat menacing brother who injected tension into the comedy. And in Country Strong, 2010, he slipped into the role of a controlling, manipulative manager, a man more concerned with money and fame than with the emotional well-being of his artists. Again and again, Hollywood tapped him for roles that showcased a hard, antagonistic edge rather than the warm, romantic crooner country fans adored. Off-screen, McGraw's Hollywood crossover wasn't free from controversy. Stories about his temper, clashes with paparazzi, and public struggles, including a near collapse from alcohol abuse in 2008, fueled the perception that the darkness he portrayed on screen wasn't entirely fictional. Tabloids painted him as a man whose picture-perfect marriage concealed tension and volatility. Though McGraw eventually got sober and reinvented himself as a health-conscious, disciplined performer, the shadow of his Hollywood villain roles lingered in the public's imagination. For fans, Tim McGraw represents a paradox. On stage, he embodied hope, love, and resilience. On screen, he became the face of broken families, ruthless authority, and toxic masculinity. The contrast was startling, and it forever reshaped how audiences saw him. To this day, McGraw's Hollywood career underscores how thin the line can be between hero and villain, and how even country music's golden boy can become Hollywood's antagonist. Willie Nelson. Few names in country music carry as much weight as Willie Nelson. With his unmistakable braids, weathered face, and smooth, soulful voice, Nelson rose to become one of the genre's most iconic figures. His songs like On the Road Again and Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain made him a legend, and his outlaw persona gave him credibility as someone who lived outside the strict confines of Nashville tradition. To fans, he was the rebel poet who turned his back on the country establishment and forged his own path. But when Willie ventured into Hollywood, his outlaw image, already tinged with danger, took on an even darker shade. Hollywood quickly realized that Willie wasn't just a singer. He was a natural on screen. Yet instead of casting him as the lovable cowboy, directors leaned into the edge that made him so fascinating. In films like Barbarossa, 1982, he played a hardened outlaw living by violence, a role that mirrored his real-life reputation. His shaggy look, piercing eyes, and unshakable calm made him a perfect fit for characters who lived on the wrong side of the law. To audiences unfamiliar with country's softer ballads, Willie Nelson looked less like a gentle troubadour and more like a dangerous drifter who could turn at any moment. The problem was that his Hollywood villain persona wasn't entirely fiction. Nelson's personal life fed into the narrative. Arrests for marijuana possession, well-publicized battles with the IRS, and his unapologetic defiance of authority gave tabloids plenty of material. In the eyes of Hollywood, this wasn't a man pretending to be an outlaw. It was the real deal. And for some fans, the blurring of art and life tarnished the image of the sweet-voiced balladeer they adored. By the 1990s and 2000s, Nelson had cemented himself as a cultural icon, but Hollywood continued to cast him in roles that played off his dangerous outlaw mystique. Whether cameoing as a grizzled, untrustworthy drifter or as a sly mentor with questionable motives, he carried the air of someone who couldn't fully be trusted. In films like Dukes of Hazzard, 2005, his wisecracking Uncle Jesse character even had villainous undertones of law-bending and rule-breaking, solidifying his image as a man living by his own code, not society's. Behind the charm, there was always a hint of menace. Willie Nelson was the kind of figure Hollywood loved, unpredictable, untamed, and unwilling to play by the rules. For his country fans, this duality was unsettling. The gentleman who sang about love and loss had, in Hollywood, become the archetype of the outlaw villain. Today, Willie's legacy straddles both worlds. He remains one of country music's most beloved legends, yet his Hollywood career and turbulent personal life etched an image of him as more than a singer. He was a rebel who could easily be mistaken for a villain. In the end, Willie Nelson became proof that sometimes the line between country hero and Hollywood outlaw is dangerously thin. Johnny Cash. Johnny Cash was known to millions as the Man in Black, a towering figure in country music whose deep baritone and stark lyrics made him one of the most recognizable voices of the 20th century. Songs like Folsom Prison Blues and I Walk the Line cemented his reputation as both outlaw and moral storyteller, a man who could embody the sinner and the saint in the same breath. On stage, dressed in black, he carried the weight of the downtrodden, the forgotten, and the broken. To his fans, Cash was a hero who sang for those without a voice. But in Hollywood, that dark persona took on new dimensions, often pushing him closer to the role of the villain. Cash's Hollywood career began in the 1960s, and from the start, he gravitated toward roles that leaned into his outlaw mystique. In A Gunfight, 1971, he played opposite Kirk Douglas in a story of two aging gunfighters locked in a deadly showdown. His stoic demeanor and natural intensity made him convincing as a man who lived by violence. Even when he wasn't cast outright as a villain, his screen presence carried a menace that blurred the line between hero and anti-hero. Audiences weren't sure if they were meant to root for him or fear him. His off-screen life fed directly into this perception. Struggles with drug addiction, arrests for smuggling pills, and infamous run-ins with the law shaped a public image that Hollywood was eager to exploit. When he sang about prison, crime, and sin, people believed him because he lived it. In an industry obsessed with authenticity, Cash's demons gave him credibility, but also painted him as a figure more dangerous than noble. Hollywood directors saw not just a singer, but a man whose darkness could anchor any role with villainous undertones. By the 1980s and 1990s, Cash leaned further into roles that emphasized his brooding edge. Guest spots on television often cast him as morally ambiguous figures, sheriffs with a cruel streak, lawmen whose sense of justice bordered on corruption, or loners whose silence hinted at violence. In each role, his natural gravitas made him more believable as a villain than as a simple hero. For fans, this dual image was jarring. The man who sang Ring of Fire with passion and vulnerability could also transform into a Hollywood figure whose aura was intimidating, even frightening. Some embraced it as part of his outlaw legacy, while others felt uneasy watching their country idol become a cinematic villain. Ultimately, Johnny Cash's Hollywood journey mirrored his life, complex, shadowed, and filled with contradictions. He was both savior and sinner, champion and criminal, hero and villain. In Hollywood, those contradictions often tilted toward the darker side, forever etching him as one of country's greatest singers who carried the weight of a villain when the cameras rolled. Merle Haggard's story was tailor-made for country music legend, a man who rose from poverty, prison, and pain to become one of the genre's greatest songwriters and performers. With hits like Mama Tried, Okie from Muskogee, Muskogee, and Sing Me Back Home, Haggard gave voice to the working-class struggles of America, blending honesty with grit. Fans embraced him as the everyman who had lived hard and sung harder. But when Hollywood came calling, it wasn't the poet or the troubadour they wanted. It was the outlaw, the ex-convict, the man whose shadowed past made him perfect for roles steeped in villainy. Haggard's early life set the tone. He spent time in San Quentin prison after a string of petty crimes and botched robberies. That background, while fueling some of his greatest songs, also cast a long shadow. When he appeared in films or on television, directors leaned into that image. He wasn't cast as the wholesome cowboy or tender balladeer. Instead, he was the hardened drifter, the dangerous man who looked like he might explode at any moment. Even in cameo roles, Merle brought with him the aura of someone who had truly walked on the dark side. Hollywood recognized this authenticity. In various TV appearances and specials, he was often depicted less as a polished celebrity and more as the embodiment of the outlaw spirit. His weathered face, piercing eyes, and restrained intensity made him convincing as a man capable of both violence and sorrow. Audiences who only knew his music were shocked to see how naturally he fit the role of a villain, but those familiar with his past weren't surprised. They knew Merle had lived that life before he ever sang about it. Off-screen, Haggard's reputation only reinforced the image. Known for his volatile temper, struggles with addiction, and politically charged songs, he often clashed with both Nashville elites and Hollywood executives. To some, he was a folk hero standing up for his beliefs. To others, he was a dangerous troublemaker who thrived on confrontation. Hollywood loved that tension, but for fans, it made his screen roles as villains feel uncomfortably real. By the later years of his career, Merle had softened in public, embracing the role of elder statesman of country music, but the villainous edge never fully disappeared. Even in interviews, there was a glint in his eye that suggested the outlaw inside him was still there. For Hollywood, he would always be the convict-turned-star who brought authenticity to roles drenched in menace. In the end, Merle Haggard embodied the outlaw spirit both in music and on screen. He was celebrated as a country legend, but carried the aura of a man who had lived dangerously, a man who could easily be cast as Hollywood's villain. His story proved that sometimes the darkest past creates the most unforgettable presence. Waylon Jennings was one of the central figures of the outlaw country movement, a man who refused to bow to Nashville's rules, and instead carved his own path with raw, unfiltered music. Hits like Luckenbach, Texas, and Good-Hearted Woman made him a legend, but it was his image, defiant, tough, and unrepentant, that defined him. To his fans, Waylon was a hero who stood against the system. Yet when Hollywood entered the picture, that same defiance translated into roles and reputations that often painted him as the villain. Jennings' first brush with the darker side of fame came not in Hollywood, but in real life. His early years were marked by drug abuse, run-ins with the law, and a volatile lifestyle that made headlines. By the 1970s, as he rose alongside Willie Nelson and other outlaws, his reputation as a dangerous, hard-living man was cemented. Hollywood, always eager to exploit real-life personas, embraced this. When Waylon appeared in films or on television, he was rarely cast as the wholesome cowboy. Instead, he embodied the rebel, the rule-breaker whose charm was edged with menace. One of his most famous contributions to Hollywood was as the narrator for the Dukes of Hazzard. His gravelly voice and sly commentary gave the show its iconic tone, but beneath the humor, there was an undeniable sense of mischief and lawlessness. Jennings himself embodied that same spirit, and many saw him as a living version of the Duke's rebellious world. Cameo appearances only reinforced that image. Waylon was the drifter, the outlaw, the man whose presence brought tension into any scene. Off-screen, his Hollywood experience was clouded by scandal. Stories of cocaine binges, wild behavior, and his infamous 1977 arrest for possession of cocaine only fueled the perception that Jennings wasn't just playing the villain, he was living it. Industry insiders whispered about his unpredictability and confrontational streak. To Nashville, he was already a thorn in the side of tradition. To Hollywood, he was a perfect typecast, the dangerous outlaw who could turn on a dime. Even as Jennings matured, cleaning up his act in the 1980s, the shadow of his villainous image lingered. His sharp eyes and rough demeanor carried the weight of a man who had lived dangerously, and Hollywood continued to exploit that energy. Fans adored him for his authenticity, but some were unsettled by how easily he fit the role of the antagonist. In the end, Waylon Jennings blurred the line between outlaw hero and Hollywood villain. His music celebrated freedom and defiance, but his Hollywood roles and public persona often tilted toward darkness. To his fans, he was the rebel they loved. To Hollywood, he was the villain they couldn't resist. Garth Brooks, Chris Gaines' persona. At the height of his fame in the 1990s, Garth Brooks was untouchable. He had revolutionized country music, blending arena rock spectacle with heartfelt country lyrics, and in the process, became the best-selling solo artist in American history. With hits like Friends in Low Places and The Dance, he wasn't just a singer, he was a phenomenon. To fans, Garth symbolized authenticity, family values, and the all-American dream. But in 1999, he made a move that stunned Nashville, baffled Hollywood, and turned one of country's brightest stars into a figure some saw as a self-made villain, the creation of Chris Gaines. The Chris Gaines project was supposed to be Garth's crossover moment into Hollywood. Conceived as a fictional alter ego, Gaines was a moody, dark pop rock star with a troubled past. Garth shaved his beard, donned a wig, eyeliner, and leather jackets, presenting a brooding character completely opposite to the clean-cut cowboy image his fans loved. The idea was to release a Chris Gaines album as a soundtrack to an upcoming movie called The Lamb, in which Garth would star. But the film never materialized, and the project collapsed under the weight of ridicule and confusion. Fans felt betrayed. Instead of the down-to-earth cowboy they adored, they were confronted with a pop persona that looked and sounded like a stranger. Country audiences rejected Chris Gaines outright, while Hollywood mocked the project as a bizarre vanity experiment. What was supposed to be Garth's big Hollywood leap instead became one of the most infamous missteps in music history. Overnight, the man once hailed as Nashville's golden boy was being cast as the villain of his own career. The backlash was brutal. Late-night comedians skewered the Chris Gaines persona, and critics labeled it career suicide. For fans, it was hard to reconcile the authenticity of Garth Brooks with the artificial darkness of Chris Gaines. The project seemed disingenuous, even manipulative, and some accused him of abandoning his roots to chase Hollywood fame. Instead of expanding his legacy, Garth had alienated the very audience that made him a superstar. Even after Brooks returned to his country image, the Chris Gaines experiment haunted him. Interviews years later revealed that he was deeply hurt by the reaction, but the damage was done. The project became a cultural punchline, remembered more as a bizarre scandal than a bold artistic risk. In the end, Garth Brooks' Chris Gaines era stands as one of the strangest intersections of country music and Hollywood. It showed how quickly a beloved hero could be recast as a villain, not by tabloids or scandals, but by his own choices. For many, it was proof that even the biggest stars can lose their way when chasing Hollywood dreams. Trace Adkins. With his towering 6'6" frame, booming baritone voice, and cowboy charisma, Trace Adkins seemed destined to be a country star. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, songs like Every Light in the House and You're Gonna Miss This made him a fixture on country radio, while his rugged looks and commanding stage presence earned him a loyal fan base. On stage, Adkins was the embodiment of Southern strength, a man who sang about heartbreak and small-town life with the authority of someone who had lived it. But when Hollywood came knocking, it wasn't the tender side of Adkins they wanted. It was the menace, the size, and the intimidation factor that turned him into a convincing villain. Hollywood discovered that Adkins had something few country singers could offer, a natural ability to embody danger. His first notable appearances in film often capitalized on his rough edges and intimidating stature. In The Lincoln Lawyer, 2011, he played Eddie Vogel, the head of a biker gang, radiating menace with just a few lines. In The Virginian, 2014, a Western remake, Adkins carried himself less like a noble cowboy and more like a hardened enforcer. Each role reinforced the same idea. This wasn't the charming country crooner audiences knew, but a figure who belonged on the darker side of the story. What made Adkins even more convincing was his real-life reputation. Behind the smooth ballads was a man with a history of turbulence. He survived being shot by his ex-wife, endured battles with alcohol, and earned a reputation for a fiery temper. These headlines followed him into Hollywood, where they only strengthened the sense that Trace wasn't just acting when he played menacing characters. He was drawing from a life of chaos and survival. Hollywood directors leaned into this authenticity. Adkins popped up in action films and thrillers, often cast as the heavy, the man audiences were meant to fear. His deep, gravelly voice and intimidating presence made him unforgettable even in smaller roles. Unlike other country stars who tried to soften their image for the big screen, Adkins embraced the darkness, cementing himself as a natural villain. For his country fans, it was a startling transformation. The man who once sang tenderly about family and faith now appeared on screen as gang leaders, criminals, and ruthless outlaws. Some admired his versatility, but others felt uneasy seeing their favorite singer embody Hollywood's darkest roles. In the end, Trace Adkins became a rare kind of crossover, one who didn't chase romantic leads or charming cowboys, but instead leaned fully into Hollywood villainy. His career proves that sometimes the line between country star and cinematic bad guy isn't as far apart as fans might hope. And for Trace, it was a role he played all too convincingly. Billy Ray Cyrus. When Billy Ray Cyrus burst onto the scene in 1992 with Achy Breaky Heart, he became an overnight sensation. His mullet, flashy style, and catchy dance anthem turned him into a global name, almost single-handedly sparking the line dancing craze of the early 90s. At first, he was the golden boy of Nashville, charismatic, good-looking, and marketable to audiences well beyond country music. But when the spotlight shifted from Music Row to Hollywood, his reputation began to shift. Instead of being embraced as a wholesome star, Billy Ray found himself cast in a villainous light, both on screen and in the court of public opinion. Hollywood gave him opportunities, but they weren't always flattering. In TV appearances and films, Cyrus often played characters who were rough-edged, selfish, or morally questionable. He never fully escaped the shadow of Achy Breaky Heart, and as he tried to reinvent himself through acting, the roles leaned darker. On the big screen, projects like Mulholland Drive, 2001, showcased him in tense, unsettling situations, while his presence in low-budget films often typecast him as the troubled man audiences were meant to distrust. Hollywood seemed to view him less as a hero and more as a cultural oddity, a fallen star whose aura lent itself to antagonism. But perhaps the greater villainy associated with Billy Ray Cyrus came from his personal and family life under Hollywood's unforgiving spotlight. As Miley Cyrus skyrocketed to fame through Hannah Montana in the mid-2000s, Billy Ray was thrust into a new role, not just performer, but stage father. For a time, he was celebrated for supporting his daughter's career, even co-starring on the Disney Channel Phenomenon. Yet as Miley's image grew increasingly controversial, Billy Ray's presence began to draw criticism. tabloids accused him of exploiting his daughter's fame, while others painted him as a weak father figure who had lost control. In the eyes of Hollywood gossip, he wasn't the loving dad. He was part of the problem, a shadowy figure complicit in Miley's shocking transformation from Disney darling to pop provocateur. Scandals only added fuel. His divorce, public feuds, and erratic interviews made him a tabloid target. Even when he defended himself, claiming the pressures of Hollywood had torn his family apart, many saw him as a man who had sold out his integrity for fame. To some, Billy Ray Cyrus wasn't just a country star who stumbled in Hollywood. He was the villain of his own family's story. Today, his musical comeback with hits like the Old Town Road remix has softened his image, but the Hollywood years remain a cautionary tale. Billy Ray's journey shows how quickly a country sensation can be recast as a villain once the Hollywood machine takes over. For many, he'll always be the man who went from H.E., breaky heart, to Hollywood heartache.